will very quickly talk about sort of colonial divide and rule that is embedded inside modern knowledges. I'll talk about two kinds of those divide and rule, basically built upon certain kinds of superiorisms for control and then for extractivism, which as I just argued, these are very modern features of society and technology and science and relationships with nature. And then, of course, I will share, this idea that, of course, these features, even though different modernities emerge and arise around the world, these features of control and extractivism get carried over because of the hard, obdurate materiality that they come associated, built in. And finally, I'll open up for discussion with you guys, which is about recognizing coloniality in your own research practices. All right. So here's a quote from Walter Mignolo from 2003, where he basically says, well, colonialism is not just about accumulation of money. It is equally at the same time about accumulation of meaning and of knowledge. And of course, it is very, very important to remember that accumulation in this particular form that we have seen has also been constituted by very many different forms of violence. And one of those forms of violence is epistemological violence, which, for example, destroyed libraries, 3 of the world's greatest libraries about exactly 500 years ago in Tenochtitlan, Mexico, and other cities in Mexico. Were they considered worthless, or was the purpose really here monopolization of knowledge to dismantle other knowledge systems so that only moderns can have the claims to knowledge, claims to science? So in this particular case too, in 16th century Mexico, in 1562, the bishop, Franciscan, by the way, bishop of Yucatan, Diego de Landa, he himself oversaw personally the burning of all but 3 Mayan codices. Codices are these scriptures, alongside many religious idols, of course, of the Mayans. And de Landa is then famous also at the same time for torturing Mayan indigenous people. He is, interestingly, even if you go now to his Wikipedia page, for example, he is also celebrated as is the person who has given us 99% of what we know about the Mayans. Okay, so think about this monopoly control over knowledge production, that this man who destroys Mayans, tortures them, is also then later, until 21st century, celebrated as the scholar of Mayan culture, religion, and language. And of course, this is not an isolated case. This kind of extraction of knowledge from other cultures, other parts of the world, has been going on for 5 centuries till now. Bruno Latour in 1987 studied the production of science in these forms through what he calls centers of calculation. So here in this picture on the left-hand side, the picture shows people going away to other parts of the world, let's say to the field or whatever it might be, crossing people's paths, learning from them, coming back to their center of calculation and accumulating there. And as they do multiple of these trips, multiple of these going aways and coming back and crossing other people's paths in the way, knowledge accumulates, goes from X2, X1 to X2 to X3 and so on and so forth. Now, of course, this is the concentrations of knowledge accumulation of knowledge, concentrations of access to knowledge, that modern knowledge that we even now see, for example, in the access to COVID-19 vaccines or whatever you want to look at in terms of example, the internet flows and so on and so forth. Yeah. But there is another type of coloniality of knowledge, which is coloniality that is built into knowledge. Now here, knowledge is used for justification of colonialism. A very famous example here is what has happened in Australia, where the so-called law of wild beasts was invoked, a Roman law of wild beasts was invoked to say that a thing that, such as a wild beast, that is not taken by anybody becomes the property of the first taker. Now that anybody here is only, of course, the colonial settler, the colonizer. Colonized people themselves were often considered little better than beasts themselves, so they could not be the property owners at that time. They were not considered as already takers of these things. Of course, there was a debate around them, but the British again then stepped in with Locke's theory and said, well, they are not using it effectively or they're not using it efficiently. They haven't turned trees into chairs. So they can't be owners of these property. We can take them because these are nobody's things. These are res nullius. Or later legal arguments about terra nullius, to just justify the appropriation of colonized lands. Legal justifications, conceptual justifications. Now, This was also carried on into the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, 1880s, where a German law professor invoked this whole idea, extended terra nullius into territorium nullius, which became the idea that, no country in Africa, no part of Africa, no nation in Africa is sovereign that is not being ruled by Europeans. So he said, it is an exaggeration to talk about the sovereignty of savage or half barbarian people. So in that sense, he justifies the so-called scramble for Africa by European powers through invoking this notion of territorium nullius. And further beyond, he says, well, yeah, your res nullius was about private property. This applies to public law. So there you go. Entire nations, entire countries could be taken over using territorium nullius as a justification. Now, this justification, I feel, is embedded inside the heart of modern knowledges that, for example, also divide subjects from objects. So here, fictitious divides between subjects and objects are constructed to prioritize categories over relations. So, exploitation, extraction, and all of that can be overlooked if you say, well, categories matter, not the relations between them. So on one side, we have subjects who invent, and the other side of the divide, we have objects that are known without agency. Agency in the case of objects of nature is marginalized. In the case of subjects, it's valorized. And of course, as I said, relations are overlooked or not marginalized in relation to the categories themselves, as opposed to the categories themselves. So here, subjects who know, invent, can then act on, because they are the repositories of agency, can then act on objectifying and knowing nature, or whatever your units of analysis, your objects of knowledge might be. Here, for example, control is imagined through sampled homogeneities. Control is imagined through fields that are simply there for data extraction. And also natural units of analysis might be separated out without looking at how culture, how subjectivity is present in those. Of course, on the other side, heroes are constructed as rational knowers, and their knowledge is then presented as generally applicable, whether it is Watts or Darwin or any of the 20th century heroes that have been given Nobel Prizes. Now, of course, none of this goes unresisted. Nature also resists and presents itself as intractable, but these uncertainties that nature imposes upon us, that nature cannot be completely fully known, are also marginalized as data is extracted for purposes of knowledge production. Now, this is the first divide and rule that I wanted to talk about that is very deeply embedded inside modern knowledge production, whether it is the natural sciences or the social sciences that have often modeled themselves on the natural sciences. Any questions till now? Any questions in the chat? No. Okay, so then there is a second divide, which is what post-colonial studies have studied a lot. So the first divide has been studied effectively by STS, Science Technology Studies, but this one has been done, a lot of justice to it, a lot of work on it has been done by post-colonial studies. Here, what I would call the wonder of cultural difference is turned into a divide, a separation, a conflict, even a dialectic, represented particularly in the form of the master-slave dialectic studied since Hegel. So here there is the superiorized self, who is the rational knowledge producer, fully human, as opposed to the infrahuman other, which is inferiorized, who is inferiorized. Universalizable values and knowledges are produced by the superiorized self. The other is embedded inside, entangled inside the particular that he or she cannot escape. Often in the purpose of spreading superiorism, spreading universalism of modern sciences, difference of the other might be just simply ignored or occluded or excluded too. So here, this superiorism, this inferiorization of the other, also then serves to enact control of what kind of directions of change, societal change, socio-material change can unfold in those societies. Modern technologies might be given by first paving the way by problematizing. This is what Arturo Escobar studied already in the 1990s, by first essentializing other cultures as negative, as bad, as repositories of deficiencies or whatever not, that need to be replaced, superimposed with modernization. And of course, none of this again went unresisted or adapted or hesitated or refused. All of that happened alongside. But the fact of the matter remains, even now, that it's the superiorized modern self, whether it comes to sustainable innovation or whatever not, is considered to be the maker of facts, those are purified from values, is considered to be leading through innovation, while other cultures, other indigenous cultures and vernacular cultures around the world are still considered to be stagnant, if not simply backward. Now, what the combined effect of these two sort of processes, these two types of divide and rule in modernity, is this globalization of modernization. All these different kinds of alternative modernities from India to South Africa to Bolivia have been established around the world, but common to them often happen to be features of standardization, unequal accumulation of resources, a certain modern sense of order built upon blocks and squares and lines that run straight, a certain kind of individualism that is perpetuated not just through economic frameworks, whether neoliberal or not, but also equally through rights-based arguments of law. Binarism is perpetuated, not just nature culture, but also in sexual terms, has been historically. Transgressive sexualities in a place like India were criminalized during colonialism. Only in 2018, homosexuality was finally, after a long protracted struggle, legalized in that country. There's a certain form of universalizing rationalism. Oh, sorry, before I go there, I do want to mention that in all of this, I am talking about capital M modernities, what I often call capital M modernities. There are small m modernities that have an egalitarian sort of ethos to them, but I consider very much to be products of emancipatory struggles against this big M colonial modernities. And part of these big M colonial modernities, as we know, is the question of extractivism, also equally the toxic trails that these extractivisms leave behind of natural resources from mines and agricultural plantations and so on and so forth. Universalizing rationalism of modern sciences that only believe we are the only rational way of knowing this, nobody else who can know rationally apart from modern scientists. Industrialization, generally large scale, preferably large scale, infrastructure the same, the larger the better. Superiorism of all kinds, whether it is religious superiorism or simply racism, and also extending capitalism as part of this, perpetuation of modernities, particularly since the 1990s, since socialism, communism has by and large effectively collapsed around the world. So what I'm trying to show here is that 500 years ago, there was an immense diversity of cultures, relations with natures, many worlds, so to speak, plural ways of living, knowing, and making around the world that met their fate in colonialism, in developmentalism of the 20th century, and neoliberal globalization of the late 20th and early 21st century to produce these alternative modernities, which I'm here calling destructivist modernities around the world, with the capital M. And the heart of modernity is coloniality. Now, of course, that is also built into modern research practices, and these three elements that I have identified: superiorism of modern knowledges, control over other cultures and natures, extractivism for modernization, extractivism of resources for modernization, for eco-modernization too, are related to each other. One helps the other, one assists the other in order to extend the other.